I trudged down the street, hands stuffed deep into my coat pockets, trying to block out the biting cold. The night was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound, your own footsteps, the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional creak of a shutter. It was close to midnight, and I was coming off a 12-hour shift at the diner, the kind of shift that leaves your legs sore and your brain numb. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Every now and then a soft knock echoed from one of the houses along the street. The first time, I didn't think much of it. Probably someone visiting a friend or getting home late. But then it happened again, this time from a house on the opposite side of the road. The knocks were oddly spaced out, almost rhythmic and always faint. I glanced around, looking for someone moving from house to house, but the street was empty. Not a single car drove by, and all the windows were dark. My pace quickened. As I turned onto my street, the tapping faded into the distance, replaced by the hum of streetlights. My apartment building loomed ahead, a drab grey structure with peeling paint and broken mailboxes. The kind of place where neighbours didn't ask questions and the landlord didn't answer them. The elevator was out as usual, so I took the stairs to the 4th floor. By the time I reached my door, my chest was tight and my legs burned. I fumbled for my keys, dropped them once, then finally managed to unlock the door. For some reason, the first thing I did after stepping inside was lock it behind me. That wasn't like me. I rarely bothered. This neighborhood wasn't great, but I'd lived here long enough to know nobody messed with anyone else's doors. Still, tonight felt different. The unease stayed with me as I hung up my coat and kicked off my shoes. The apartment was small but comfortable. A cluttered living room that doubled as a dining area, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom that barely fit my bed and a dresser. The air was stale, and I made a mental note to crack a window in the morning. I plopped onto the couch and turned on the TV, hoping for some late-night noise to drown out my thoughts. The flickering light filled the room, but it did little to chase away the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching me. Every now and then, I'd glance toward the windows, but the blinds were shut tight. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. It had been a long day, and I was just overtired. Then, at exactly midnight, it happened. A single, deliberate knock echoed from my front door. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand and landing on the floor with a dull thud. The knock wasn't loud, but in the silence of my apartment, it might as well have been an explosion. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear any follow-up sound, footsteps, voices, anything, but there was nothing, just silence. Finally, I mustered the courage to get up and approach the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I leaned against the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, lit by the weak fluorescent bulbs that always seemed to be on the verge of flickering out. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for something to move, to give away whoever had knocked. But the longer I stared, the more convinced I became that no one was there. I backed away from the door, shaking my head. Probably just some drunk neighbor messing around, I muttered to myself. Still, I couldn't completely shake the unease that had settled over me. That's when I noticed the footprints. Faint but unmistakable, they trailed away from my door down the hall, fading into the carpet as they got further away. The thing was, they weren't boot prints or sneakers. They were bare feet. A chill ran down my spine. "Who the hell walks around barefoot in December?" I whispered. I debated whether I should call someone, maybe the landlord or even the cops. But what would I say? "Hi, there's some barefoot weirdo knocking on doors." They'd laugh me off the phone. Shaking off the fear, I returned to the couch and turned the TV volume up. I wasn't going to let some random knock freak me out. Eventually, I fell asleep there, the sound of late-night reruns blending into my dreams. But even in sleep, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. Another knock the next night. I spent the entire next day on edge. Every sound in the diner, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the grill, seemed sharper, more intrusive. I couldn't shake the memory of that knock or the faint, chilling footprints trailing away from my door. By the time my shift ended, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a kid from the building playing a prank, or one of my neighbors stumbling home drunk. Still, I couldn't entirely quiet the gnawing unease. When I got home, I made a point of checking the hallway. Nothing unusual, no footprints, no signs of anyone lurking around. I shook my head at my own paranoia as I locked the door and double-checked it this time. The hours dragged on, and the later it got, the more restless I became. Midnight approached, and a part of me dreaded the possibility that it might happen again. And then it did. This time, the knock was louder. Not a polite tap, but a deliberate, forceful sound like someone was demanding to be let in. My stomach dropped. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, staring at the door. The TV was on again, but I didn't hear a word of it over the pounding of my heart. The knock came again, and then again, each one more insistent than the last. I approached the door slowly, my hands trembling. My first instinct was to look through the peephole, but something stopped me. A tiny, irrational voice in my head screamed, "Don't look, don't acknowledge it." For several minutes, I just stood there, waiting for the sound to stop. Finally, the knocking ceased. I exhaled shakily, my body heavy with relief, but then, "Let me in." The whisper came from the other side of the door, low and rasping, barely louder than a breath. I stumbled backward, my skin crawling. Whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't sound normal. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I called Mark, my best friend since college. If anyone could make sense of this, it was him. Mark was the logical one, the skeptic. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or anything remotely supernatural. "You're seriously freaked out over a knock?" Mark said, his voice laced with amusement. "Maybe it's your neighbor locking themselves out, or some weirdo pulling a prank." "It's not just the knocking," I said, pacing my apartment. "There was a whisper last night. Something was outside my door." "A whisper? Like what?" "It said, 'Let me in.'" Mark laughed, the kind of laugh that made you feel like an idiot for even bringing it up. "Dude, you've been working too much. You're hearing things. Maybe you fell asleep with the TV on and your brain got weird." I wanted to argue, but I could already hear the disbelief in his tone. Instead, I made him promise to come over that night, and he reluctantly agreed. That evening, Mark helped me set up my phone to record the hallway outside my door. "This'll prove it's nothing," he said, rolling his eyes. "You're just overthinking." But deep down, I didn't believe that. When midnight came, I felt like a coiled spring. Every nerve in my body taut. I stared at the clock, willing it to tick past 12 without incident. Then, right on cue, the knocking began. I froze, barely breathing. Mark glanced at me, his smirk faltering. The sound was steady and deliberate, like someone was testing the strength of the door. "Okay, that's a little weird," Mark admitted. But when I motioned for him to stay quiet, he rolled his eyes. He opened the door without hesitation, and just like the night before, the hallway was empty. We checked the recording together. At first, the footage seemed normal. The empty hallway, the faint hum of the building's ancient ventilation system. But then the knocks started, and something else. Just before each knock, the camera picked up a faint, shuffling sound, like bare feet dragging across the carpet. And then there was the voice. "You're not alone." It was muffled, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Mark rewound the footage 3 times, his confidence visibly shaken. "That's probably just interference or something," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. He left not long after, claiming he had work early the next morning. With Mark gone, I was alone again, and the sense of dread was worse than ever. I couldn't get the voice out of my head. "You're not alone." I started searching online for anything that might explain what was happening. Ghost stories, urban legends, local news reports, anything. What I found made my blood run cold. There were stories scattered across forums and obscure websites about people hearing knocks in the dead of night. Most of them brushed it off as a prank or a coincidence, but some described hearing voices, and just a few, mentioned that after the knocks started, people went missing. One post stood out to me. It was from someone who lived just a few blocks away. They claimed the knocks started innocently enough, but each night they grew louder and more persistent. The voice outside their door had begged to be let in, promising safety, companionship, and other lies. The poster had ignored it for weeks, but one night they gave in and opened the door. The post ended abruptly with a chilling note. "If you hear a knock after midnight, don't open the door, no matter what." I sat back, my heart pounding. Whatever this was, it wasn't a prank. It wasn't in my head, it was real, and it wasn't going to stop. Over the next week, my life turned into a waking nightmare. The knocking, once confined to midnight, started happening at random times, 2 a.m., 3:30, sometimes even during the day. The irregularity only made it worse because I never knew when to expect it. And then, it wasn't just the knocks. Objects in my apartment began moving on their own. I'd leave my keys on the counter, only to find them on the coffee table moments later. Lights flickered, and no matter how tightly I closed the windows, the air always felt heavy, like the entire apartment was holding its breath. But the worst was the feeling. I could feel it watching me. Whatever it was always there. I'd turn around, expecting to catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye, but there was nothing. Still, the sensation of being observed, of having my every move scrutinized, never went away. It was suffocating. By the 5th night, I was at my breaking point. Desperate, I called Mark. "Dude, I don't care what you think. I need you to stay here tonight," I said, my voice shaking. "Alex, you're letting this get to you," Mark replied, but he could hear the panic in my voice. "All right, fine, I'll come over, but I'm telling you, there's got to be a logical explanation for all this." When Mark arrived, he did his usual routine of teasing me, poking fun at the fact that I was scared of a ghostly door-to-door salesman. I didn't even bother responding. That night, we waited together. Midnight came and went, but the knocking didn't start. Mark gave me a smug look. "See? You're psyching yourself out, man." I wanted to believe him, but something felt off. The apartment was eerily quiet, and the oppressive feeling hadn't lifted. Still, Mark's presence helped calm my nerves, if only slightly. Before he left the next morning, he suggested setting up more cameras. "Let's prove once and for all there's nothing weird going on," he said. "If it makes you feel better, we'll cover all the angles." The next morning, I woke up to review the footage. At first, it was normal, an empty hallway, the static hum of the cameras. But as I scrubbed through the footage, something caught my eye. At 3:17 a.m., the camera facing my front door picked up movement. A dark, shadowy figure appeared, barely more than a blur at first. It lingered just outside the door, its outline flickering like a glitch in a video game. I paused the footage, staring at the screen. The figure was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs slightly too long. It moved awkwardly, almost like it didn't quite understand how a human should walk, and then it stopped. The figure turned toward the camera, or at least, I think it did. Its head tilted unnaturally, as though it were studying me through the lens. My stomach turned. I called Mark, my voice shaking. "You need to see this," I said. He arrived within the hour, his usual skepticism replaced by genuine concern. We watched the footage together, and even he couldn't find an explanation. That's not normal," he admitted, his voice low. But he still wasn't ready to believe it was something supernatural. "It could be someone messing with you, some kind of projection or, I don't know, a glitch with the camera." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew better. Mark decided to stay another night. "If this thing's real, let's see it for ourselves," he said. That evening, the atmosphere was even heavier than before. It felt like the apartment itself was waiting, holding its breath for what was to come. Midnight arrived, and the knocking began. This time, it was different. The knocks weren't steady. They were erratic, louder than before, as though whatever was on the other side was losing patience. "Don't open it," I whispered, gripping Mark's arm. He shook me off. "Relax, Alex. If someone's out there, we need to know who it is." Before I could stop him, Mark unbolted the lock and swung the door open. The hallway was empty. Mark stepped outside, peering up and down the corridor. He turned back to me, a smirk on his face. "See? Nothing to worry about." He stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. "What?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Mark didn't answer. He just stood there, staring into the hallway, as if something was standing right in front of him. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The air in the hallway was ice cold, so frigid that I could see my breath. Mark stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut behind him. "What was it?" I demanded, but he just shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. After a moment, he forced a nervous laugh. "Probably just a draft or something. Don't worry about it." But I could see the truth in his expression. He didn't believe his own words. Mark left soon after, muttering something about needing to get home early. I didn't stop him, though I desperately wanted to. As the door closed behind him, I realized something chilling. For the first time, Mark had looked scared. And Mark was never scared. Whatever was outside my door wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to leave me alone. I didn't sleep the night Mark left. Every sound, the groan of the building's pipes, the creak of the floorboards, set my nerves on edge. By morning, I was a wreck, my head pounding and my thoughts spiraling. That's when the email came. The subject line read, "If you hear a knock after midnight, don't open the door." My stomach flipped as I clicked on it. There was no sender listed, no name, just the cryptic subject line and a block of text. It feeds on fear. It isolates you, drains you, and waits for you to give in. The rule is simple. Don't open the door. Acknowledge it, and it grows stronger. Let it in, and you won't survive. It can't come in unless you open the door first. If you've already broken the rule, you're marked. It will follow you until it has what it wants. The only way to weaken it is to ignore it. Deny its existence, no matter what you hear, no matter what it shows you. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. Someone else knew what was happening to me. Someone who had experienced this before, or worse, hadn't survived it. My mind raced back to the stories I'd read online, the posts about strange knocks and disappearances. It was all real. The entity was real, and it had marked me. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let it win. I spent hours barricading my apartment, pushing furniture against the door and sealing every window. I unplugged the TV and covered the mirrors, as though cutting off any reflective surface might somehow weaken its power. Midnight was coming, and I was determined to resist. When the clock struck 12, the knocking began. At first, it was the same deliberate rhythm as before. 3 steady knocks, then a pause. 3 more knocks. I sat in the living room clutching a baseball bat, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It didn't stop this time, didn't give me the usual few minutes of quiet to catch my breath. The door rattled in its frame, the wood groaning as if something massive was leaning against it. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispering to myself, "It's not real. It's not real. It's not real." Then came the voice. "Let me in, Alex." It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, sharp, almost mocking. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to drown it out. But the voice didn't stop. "You're all alone. Nobody's coming to help you. Let me in." The knocking turned into pounding, the door shaking violently. I stayed where I was, frozen in terror. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. I sat there, trembling, waiting for the next move. That's when I heard it. A knock. Not from the door this time, but from behind me. I turned slowly, my blood running cold. The knock came again, softer, as if it was coming from inside the apartment. My heart hammered in my chest as I scanned the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, a shadow began to take shape. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and though it had no eyes, I could feel it staring at me. "You opened the door before, didn't you?" it said, its voice a chilling chorus of whispers layered together. I backed away, stumbling over the coffee table. No, I didn't. But then I remembered. Months ago, when I first moved into the apartment, there had been a knock late at night. I'd opened the door without thinking, expecting it to be a neighbor or a delivery. There had been no one there. I'd dismissed it at the time, assuming it was a mistake. But now, as the shadowy figure loomed closer, I realized that was the moment it had marked me. "You've been following me this whole time," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. The entity didn't respond, but it didn't need to. Its presence was answer enough. "You're waiting for me to give up," I said, my voice shaking. It tilted its head further, almost in amusement. "You're already broken, Alex. Let me in, and it will all be over." Its voice was intoxicating, pulling at the edges of my sanity. For a split second, I considered it. But then I remembered the email, the warning, deny its existence, no matter what. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe. "You're not real. You don't exist. You're nothing." The entity's form flickered, its outline wavering as though I'd struck a blow. Its voice grew harsher, angrier. "You can't ignore me. I'm part of you now." But I didn't respond. I turned my back on it, refusing to look, refusing to listen. The room grew colder, and the pressure in the air became almost unbearable. My head throbbed, my body trembling as it whispered threats, promises, anything to break me. And then, finally, it stopped. The room was still. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving behind a deafening silence. I turned around, and the entity was gone. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every knock, every creak of the building sent my heart racing, but the entity didn't return. I don't know if I defeated it or if it's still waiting, biding its time. But one thing is clear, if you ever hear a knock after midnight, don't open the door, no matter what, because once you let it in, it never really leaves. The entity's grip tightens. The following nights blurred together in a haze of fear and defiance. I followed the advice from the email. Ignore it. Deny it. Strength. Whenever the knocks came, I forced myself to sit still, to tune out the noise, no matter how loud or relentless it grew. The entity didn't make it easy. It whispered from every shadow, mocking me, taunting me. Sometimes it mimicked Mark's voice, calling out from the hallway, begging to be let in. Other times, it sounded like my mother, soft and familiar, coaxing me to open the door. Each time I refused to react, the entity grew angrier. It didn't just knock anymore, it pounded, scratched, even slammed against the walls, rattling the furniture. The cold that came with its presence seeped into my bones, and the air felt too thick to breathe. But I didn't acknowledge it. The figure appeared more frequently now, flickering in the corners of my vision. Its form was distorted, shifting between a shadow and something more grotesque, elongated limbs, a face that seemed to split and reform in impossible ways. It stood silently, waiting for me to slip, to look at it too long, or cry out in fear. Once it stood at the foot of my bed as I tried to sleep, its head tilting unnaturally as it whispered, "You can't ignore me forever." I squeezed my eyes shut, my fists gripping the sheets. "You're not real," I whispered, repeating it over and over until the room fell silent again. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I endured. As dawn broke one morning, the oppressive feeling that had haunted me for weeks lifted. The air felt lighter, warmer, and the silence wasn't suffocating anymore. I dared to open the blinds, letting sunlight flood the apartment for the first time in what felt like forever. The entity was gone. I spent the next few days cautiously testing the waters, stepping outside, reconnecting with Mark, and trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. Weeks turned into a month, and life slowly began to feel ordinary again. The apartment felt safe, almost welcoming, and I even started sleeping through the night. The knocks didn't return, and I allowed myself to believe that I'd beaten it, that I'd found a way to break free. But deep down, a part of me never stopped looking over my shoulder. Final revelation. One morning, long after midnight, I was woken by a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. Knock, knock, knock. I bolted upright, my heart pounding as I glanced at the clock. It was 6:13 a.m., far past the usual time. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the mailman, a neighbor, anyone but... Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I swung my legs out of bed, moving cautiously toward the door. The hallway outside my apartment was bright with morning light, but the knocks carried the same weight, the same wrongness I'd come to know too well. I hesitated, staring at the door. My hand hovered over the peephole, every instinct screaming at me not to look, but I couldn't help myself. I pressed my eye to the peephole, and my stomach dropped. It was me. My own face stared back at me from the other side of the door, pale and distorted, with dark hollows where my eyes should have been. My lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then, faintly, the whisper came through the door. "Let me in." The knock came again, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The screen fades to black. After the inciting incident, what would you do if you were Alex? Would you open the door or play it safe? After Mark mocks Alex, have you ever had a friend not believe you about something truly terrifying? During the climax, do you think Alex can escape the entity, or is it already too late? At the end, what do you think happened to Alex? Could the entity really be gone, or was this all part of its plan? This resolution concludes the story with a chilling sense of lingering dread, leaving the audience questioning the true nature of the entity and whether Alex ever truly escaped. After the inciting incident, Alex peers through the peephole, his breath catching in his throat as the silence stretches on. No one is there, but those faint, eerie footprints trailing away into the dark hallway stick in his mind. As the camera lingers on Alex's nervous expression, the narrator says, "What would you do if you were Alex? Would you open the door or play it safe? Let us know in the comments below." Around 10 minutes in, natural call to action. The knocks have escalated and Alex is sharing his experiences with Mark, who brushes them off as paranoia. The tension builds as the viewers begin to sense Alex's growing fear and isolation. The narrator interjects smoothly. If this story has you hooked so far, hit the like button to let us know you're loving it. And don't forget to keep watching. It only gets more chilling from here. After Mark mocks Alex, Mark laughs, shaking his head as Alex tries to explain the voice he heard through the door. Have you ever had a friend not believe you about something truly terrifying? Share your stories in the comments. We'd love to hear them. Around 30 minutes in, natural call to action. As Alex and Mark review the footage, the shadowy figure's distorted movements send chills down their spines. Mark insists it's a glitch, but Alex's growing terror is palpable. The narrator cuts in seamlessly. What do you think is behind the knocks? Leave your theories in the comments. Maybe you'll solve the mystery before Alex does. During the climax, as Alex sits in his barricaded apartment, the door rattling under the entity's relentless pounding, his whispered mantra, "You're not real, you're not real," becomes the audience's only hope for his survival. The narrator asks, "Do you think Alex can escape the entity, or is it already too late?" Let us know what you'd do in his situation.